Snow was falling over Roanoke, Virginia, when Officer Caleb Monroe found a 5-month-old German Shepherd puppy tied to the police station gate. Beside him was a bag of food, an old blanket, and a handwritten note. "Please find him someone better than me." The puppy was clean, healthy, and clearly loved. So why had someone abandoned him? Caleb checked the security footage. At 4:17 that morning, an elderly man had knelt in the snow, hugged the puppy tightly, pressed his forehead against his, then walked away. But what happened next between that lonely veteran and the abandoned puppy would bring Caleb to tears. Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us, where are you watching from today? Late January had settled over Roanoke, Virginia, beneath a quiet blanket of snow, softening the streets and rooftops while the distant Blue Ridge Mountains disappeared behind a low gray sky. By the time the first pale light of morning began to gather over the city, most of Roanoke was still asleep, and the only sounds near the police station were the whisper of tires on wet pavement and the steady scrape of wind-driven snow against the iron fence. Officer Caleb Monroe was 39 years old, a tall, broad-shouldered man with short, dark brown hair, a few early strands of gray near his temples, and the calm brown eyes of someone who had spent nearly 15 years learning that people often revealed more through silence than through words. He was not naturally talkative, and years of police work had made him patient rather than hard. Frightened children tended to trust him. Elderly residents often remembered his name, and nervous animals usually discovered that the large officer approaching them was willing to wait rather than force their trust. Caleb arrived shortly before 6 that morning, carrying a paper cup of coffee in one hand while brushing snow from the shoulder of his dark winter uniform with the other. He had nearly reached the employee entrance when something beside the front gate caught his attention, and at first he thought someone had left a dark duffel bag against the fence. Then the shape moved. Caleb stopped immediately. A young German Shepherd puppy, no more than 5 months old, was sitting beside the gate with a red leash tied securely around one of the iron bars. He was already growing into the long legs and oversized paws typical of the breed, with a rich black and tan coat, a dark mask around his intelligent brown eyes, and 2 large ears that were almost fully upright, though the left one tilted slightly whenever he became uncertain. Snow had collected along his back and shoulders, and although he was visibly cold, he was not struggling against the leash or crying for attention. What struck Caleb most was where the puppy was looking. Not toward the police station. Not toward Caleb. The young shepherd was staring down the road. Caleb slowly set his coffee on a nearby ledge and approached without making any sudden movements. The puppy noticed him, watching cautiously but without aggression, and Caleb could see that there was more confusion than fear in those dark eyes. "Easy, buddy," Caleb said softly as he crouched several feet away. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The puppy's tail moved once across the snow, but instead of coming closer, he turned his head toward the street again as a passing car moved through the intersection. His ears lifted with sudden hope, and his entire body became alert until the vehicle continued past without slowing. Only then did the puppy settle again. Beside him sat an unopened bag of dog food and a folded wool blanket that had become damp around the edges. Whoever had left the dog had clearly expected him to remain there for some time, and that detail bothered Caleb almost as much as the abandonment itself. Someone had planned this carefully enough to bring food, warmth, and a sturdy leash, yet had still walked away. As Caleb examined the area, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the handle of the food bag. He removed one glove, picked it up, and opened it carefully. The message consisted of only one line, written in dark ink with letters that trembled unevenly across the page. "Please find him someone better than me." Caleb read the sentence twice before looking back at the puppy. Something about those words felt wrong, not because they were cruel, but because they sounded almost like an apology. He moved closer and gently examined the young dog, who allowed him to touch his collar without resistance. The German Shepherd was thin only in the gangly way puppies often were when growing quickly, and there were no visible signs of neglect. His coat had been brushed recently, his nails were trimmed, His ears were clean, and the leather collar around his neck was almost new and adjusted properly. There was no identification tag hanging from it, but everything else suggested that this was a puppy who had slept indoors, eaten regular meals, and known the touch of familiar hands. Caleb had seen animals abandoned before, and this did not feel like any of those cases. He untied the leash from the gate and stood, expecting the puppy to follow him toward the warmth of the station. But after 2 steps, he felt the leash grow tight behind him. When he turned, the shepherd had planted all 4 paws firmly in the snow and was once again staring toward the road. Caleb gave the leash only the slightest pull. The puppy refused to move. Another vehicle approached in the distance, and once again, the shepherd straightened hopefully, watching the headlights until the car passed the station. When it disappeared, his posture seemed to sink. Caleb studied him for a moment and understood. "You're waiting for him, aren't you?" The puppy looked briefly at Caleb before returning his attention to the road, as though the answer should have been obvious. Rather than dragging him inside, Caleb waited with him for another minute, standing silently while snow gathered along the shoulders of his uniform. Eventually he crouched, slipped one arm beneath the puppy's chest and the other behind his hind legs, and lifted him carefully. The young German shepherd was heavier than expected, all long limbs and warm breath against Caleb's jacket. Yet even while being carried through the station doors, he twisted his neck over Caleb's arm to keep the street in sight for as long as possible. That small gesture stayed with Caleb. Within 15 minutes, he was sitting in the security office, scrolling backward through footage from the exterior camera while the puppy rested beside the glass entrance where he could still see outside. Caleb worked back through the early morning until the timestamp reached 4:17 a.m. A pair of headlights appeared through the falling snow. An older pickup truck slowly pulled to the curb across from the station and remained there for several seconds before the driver's door opened. An elderly man stepped out, then moved around the vehicle with the careful stiffness of someone whose knees and back no longer obeyed as quickly as they once had. Caleb leaned closer to the monitor. He knew that man. Walter Briggs was 78 years old, a retired Army veteran who lived alone in a modest house beyond the busier neighborhoods of Roanoke. He was tall despite the slight stoop age had given him, with a lean frame, silver-white hair, deeply lined features, and an old-fashioned reserve that made him seem stern until someone spoke with him for more than a minute. Around town he was known as quiet and unfailingly polite, the sort of man who held doors open for strangers, thanked grocery clerks by name when he remembered them, and disappeared from conversations the moment they became personal. Caleb had crossed paths with him several times, but had never known much about his life. On the screen, Walter opened the passenger door and the German shepherd puppy climbed down beside him. The dog was not being dragged toward the station. He walked beside Walter willingly, close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed the old man's leg. When they reached the gate, Walter stopped and stood there for several long seconds while the snow fell around them. Then, with visible effort, he lowered himself to one knee. The puppy immediately moved closer. Walter removed one glove and began stroking the shepherd's head, running his bare hand slowly over the fur between his ears before scratching gently beneath his chin. He repeated the movement several times, almost as though he were trying to memorize the feel of the dog beneath his hand. Then the puppy placed both front paws against Walter's chest. The old man wrapped his arms around him. Caleb stopped moving. For nearly half a minute, Walter remained kneeling in the snow with the young dog held tightly against him, his face pressed into the puppy's neck. Eventually he pulled back just enough to place his forehead against the shepherd's head, and his lips moved as though he were saying something quietly. The security camera had no audio. Whatever Walter said, Caleb would never hear it. After another moment, the old veteran forced himself upright, tied the red leash securely to the iron gate, placed the food and blanket beside the puppy, and began walking toward his truck. The dog immediately tried to follow. The leash tightened. Walter stopped. Even through the grainy footage, Caleb could see the tension in the old man's shoulders, but he did not turn around immediately. He stood with his back to the puppy for several seconds before continuing across the snow. Halfway to his truck, Walter finally looked back. The puppy was standing at the end of the leash. Walter turned away and walked several more steps. Then he looked back a second time. By then, the puppy had sat down. Walter reached the truck, placed one hand on the open driver's door, and remained there for a moment before turning his head toward the station gate one final time. 3 times. Then he climbed into the pickup. Strangely, the truck did not leave at once. It remained parked beside the curb for almost a full minute, its headlights shining through the snow while Walter sat motionless behind the wheel. Only then did it pull away. Caleb remained in front of the monitor long after the truck disappeared from the recording. A faint movement near the entrance made him turn. The young German shepherd was lying beside the glass doors with his chin resting between his paws. But when another pickup passed along the road outside, his head rose instantly and his ears stood tall. He watched the vehicle with desperate attention until it vanished around the corner, and afterward he slowly lowered his head again. Caleb looked back at the frozen image on the security monitor, where Walter Briggs stood beside his truck with his face turned toward the dog he had just left behind. During his years in uniform, Caleb had learned what indifference looked like, and nothing in that recording resembled it. Walter had not handled the puppy like an inconvenience he wanted removed from his life. He had held him like something precious he could barely force himself to release. Whatever had happened before 4:17 that morning, Caleb was beginning to suspect that the real question was not why Walter Briggs no longer wanted the dog. The far more troubling question was why a man who so clearly loved him believed he had no right to keep him. And as Caleb watched the puppy continue waiting beside the glass for a truck that might never return, one thought settled heavily in his mind. How deeply did a man have to love his dog before leaving him behind could hurt this much? By late morning, the snow over Roanoke had softened into a steady drift, and the young German shepherd had finally stopped watching every vehicle that passed the station with the same desperate expectation. He had accepted a bowl of water, eaten only part of the food Caleb offered him, and then curled beneath a desk near the front windows, choosing a place where he could still see the road whenever he lifted his head. Caleb had seen abandoned animals become restless, defensive, or withdrawn, but this puppy seemed caught somewhere between hope and confusion, as though he had not yet understood that the person he trusted most had deliberately left him behind. Before arranging a transfer to the local shelter, Caleb borrowed a handheld microchip scanner kept among the station's animal control equipment and passed it slowly over the puppy's shoulders. The device chirped almost immediately. A few minutes later, the registration information appeared on Caleb's computer screen, and for the first time the young shepherd had a name: Milo. Caleb looked across the room when he said it aloud. Milo. The puppy's head came up at once, his ears lifted, and his tail struck the floor twice. That small reaction removed any doubt. Milo knew the name, which meant Walter had used it often enough, warmly enough, for the sound to still mean something good. The registration record confirmed Walter Briggs as the owner, and listed an address several miles beyond the busiest part of Roanoke, near the edge of town, where older homes sat farther apart, and long pine shadows reached across narrow roads in winter. Caleb stared at the address for a while, then looked toward Milo again. Procedure offered an easy path: document the abandonment, notify animal control, and let the shelter handle whatever came next. Yet the security footage kept returning to his mind, especially the moment Walter had pressed his forehead against the puppy's head before forcing himself to walk away. By early afternoon, Caleb had made his decision. He did not bring Milo with him, not yet. There was too much he did not understand, and showing up at Walter's door with the dog might close a conversation before it ever began. Instead, Caleb left Milo warm and safe at the station and drove alone toward the address listed on the microchip registration. The city gradually thinned behind him until storefronts gave way to older neighborhoods, wooded lots, and roads bordered by snow-covered ditches. Walter's home sat near the end of a narrow lane, a modest one-story wooden house with faded gray siding, a shallow porch, and a row of tall pine trees standing behind it like dark sentries beneath the winter sky. Nothing about the property suggested neglect. The walkway had been partially cleared. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the porch, and an old pickup truck, the same one Caleb had watched on the security footage, was parked beside a small detached garage. Caleb climbed the steps and knocked. Nothing happened. He waited, then knocked again, louder this time. Nearly a minute passed before he heard movement somewhere inside. Slow footsteps followed by the scrape of a lock. The door opened only halfway. Walter Briggs stood behind it, wearing a dark flannel shirt, worn jeans, and thick wool socks beneath old brown slippers. Without the veteran's cap Caleb usually saw him wearing around town, his silver-white hair appeared thinner than it had on camera, and the deep lines around his eyes made him look older than 78. He was still tall, though his shoulders curved slightly forward now, and there was a guardedness in his pale blue eyes that had not been obvious in the silent security footage. The moment Walter saw Caleb's uniform, his expression tightened. "Officer, Mr. Briggs." Walter's eyes moved past Caleb toward the driveway, perhaps checking whether another patrol car had followed. "If this is about this morning," he said, "I didn't damage anything. It's about the dog." Walter's jaw hardened almost imperceptibly. Caleb chose his next words carefully. "I'm here because of Milo." The change in Walter's face was immediate. It lasted no more than a second, but Caleb saw it clearly. The suspicion disappeared, replaced by something far more vulnerable, before Walter pulled the emotion back behind the same stern expression. He did not ask why Caleb had come. He did not ask whether the station intended to charge him with abandonment. He did not even ask where Milo was. His first question was quieter. "Did he eat?" Caleb paused. "A little." Walter lowered his eyes. "He won't eat much when he's upset. Give him time." There was too much familiarity in the answer for Caleb to ignore. Walter knew how Milo behaved when frightened. He knew the puppy's appetite, his habits, probably the places he liked to sleep, and the noises that woke him at night. "He's warm," Caleb added. "He's safe." Walter gave a small nod, and some tension left his shoulders. For several seconds neither man spoke. Then a gust of wind swept loose snow across the porch, and Walter seemed to realize he was leaving Caleb standing outside. "You'd better come in before my heating bill starts paying for the whole county." It was the first hint of humor Caleb had heard from him. Inside, the house was modest, but exceptionally orderly, warmed by a small iron stove that ticked softly in the living room. The furniture was old, but carefully maintained, and almost everything seemed to have occupied the same place for years. A heavy wooden table near the kitchen, a brown recliner facing the window, books arranged by size on a narrow shelf, and several framed military photographs resting beside an old brass clock. Then Caleb noticed the dog bowl. It sat beside the kitchen cabinets, half filled with fresh water. A second bowl stood beside it, clean, ready. Caleb's eyes moved toward the living room, where a thick dog bed remained beside the stove. A rubber ball was partly visible beneath Walter's recliner, covered with small puppy tooth marks. On a hook beside the back door hung another red leash, older than the one Walter had used at the station, and below it stood a pair of muddy walking boots. Walter followed Caleb's gaze. He looked uncomfortable. "You planning to inventory the place?" "No." Caleb glanced at the dog bed again. "I was just wondering why all of Milo's things are still here." Walter turned toward the kitchen. "I haven't gotten around to it." That answer might have worked if Caleb had not seen the rest of the house. Walter Briggs appeared to be the kind of man who put tools back exactly where they belonged and folded newspapers before recycling them. Nothing inside that home suggested someone who simply hadn't gotten around to removing an unwanted dog's belongings. As Walter reached into the refrigerator for a bottle of water, Caleb noticed a rectangular plastic container on the middle shelf. Pieces of cooked chicken, carrots, and rice had been portioned neatly inside. Walter saw him looking. "That's nothing. Milo's?" Walter closed the refrigerator more firmly than necessary. "He likes chicken better than that canned stuff." Caleb said nothing. The silence did more than any accusation could have. Walter finally turned around, and irritation had begun to cover whatever emotion lay underneath. "You came all the way out here to tell me I left dog food in my refrigerator?" "I came because the note said you wanted us to find him someone better. That's right, but everything in this house looks like you expected him home tonight." Walter's mouth tightened. For the first time, Caleb saw something close to anger, though it was not directed at him so much as at the conversation itself. "You've got the dog. I gave you his food. I left him somewhere safe. I don't know what else you want from me." "I want to understand why." "You'd need to." "Maybe I do, if I'm supposed to decide what happens to him." Walter looked toward the window, where snowflakes drifted past the glass. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "He's a good dog." Caleb waited. Walter swallowed. "Better than good, if you give him time. Smart. Too smart sometimes. He'll steal one sock and leave the other because apparently he enjoys making a point." The smallest trace of a smile crossed Walter's face, then vanished. "He deserves somebody who can give him what he needs. And you can't?" Walter's expression closed again. "No." "Why?" The old man looked directly at Caleb now. "Because I'm not the right person for him anymore." There was finality in the words, and Caleb understood that pushing harder would only make Walter retreat. He had spent enough years interviewing people to recognize the moment when a question stopped opening doors and started locking them. Caleb stood. Near the front entrance, a framed photograph on a narrow shelf caught his attention. It showed Walter, decades younger, standing in military uniform beside several other soldiers. Young Walter was lean and straight-backed, his expression serious but confident, one hand resting on the shoulder of the man beside him. The photograph had faded with age, and one corner had been folded inward so many times that a white crease cut diagonally across the image. Caleb had just turned toward the door when a violent metallic crash sounded from outside. A trash can had blown over near the road. Walter's reaction was instant. His entire body jerked. One hand shot toward the doorframe, gripping it hard enough for his knuckles to whiten, while the other began trembling violently at his side. For several seconds, Walter stared past Caleb without seeming to see him. Then he blinked, tightened his jaw, and forced his hand into his pocket. "I'm fine." Caleb had not asked. He stepped onto the porch without challenging the statement and pulled the door gently closed behind him. As he walked toward his patrol car, he glanced back once. Through the narrow front window, he could still see the edge of Milo's bed beside the stove. The bowl was still waiting. The leash was still hanging by the door. And somewhere inside that carefully ordered house was a 78-year-old man who had removed the dog from his life without removing a single sign that the dog belonged there. Caleb climbed into his car, but he did not start the engine immediately. For the first time, he began to suspect that Walter Briggs had not abandoned Milo because caring for the puppy had become inconvenient. Whatever had made the old veteran leave him at the police station seemed to begin with fear. And Caleb was no longer certain that Milo was the one Walter was afraid of. The following afternoon, the snow over Roanoke had begun to thin beneath a pale winter sun, leaving the roads wet and dark between banks of white piled along the shoulders. Caleb had spent most of the morning thinking about Walter Briggs, the untouched dog bed beside the stove, the prepared food in the refrigerator, and the way the old veteran's hand had begun to shake after the crash of a metal trash can outside his house. None of it fit the picture of a man who truly wanted his dog gone. And by lunchtime, Caleb had decided there was only one way to learn what Walter was refusing to say. He brought Milo back. The young German shepherd had been restless since waking, eating better than the day before but still lifting his head whenever footsteps approached the station doors. The moment Caleb clipped the leash to his collar and led him outside, Milo seemed to sense that something had changed. He jumped into the patrol vehicle without hesitation, turning in a quick circle before settling in the rear seat, his large paws sliding awkwardly on the protective cover as he tried to watch both Caleb and the road at the same time. For the first several miles, Milo behaved like any 5-month-old puppy taken on an unexpected ride, pressing his nose toward the window and following passing cars with bright curiosity. Then Caleb turned onto the narrower road leading toward Walter's neighborhood. Milo changed immediately. His ears rose. He stood. By the time the pine trees surrounding Walter's property came into view, the puppy was whining softly and shifting from one side of the seat to the other. When Caleb turned into the driveway, Milo recognized the old pickup beside the garage, and the sound that came from him was no longer uncertain. He let out a high, excited cry and planted both front paws against the door, his tail striking the seat with enough force to make Caleb smile despite himself. "All right," Caleb said as he parked. "I guess I don't need to tell you where we are." Milo was already trying to reach the handle. Caleb barely had time to step out and open the rear door before the puppy launched himself into the snow. The leash slipped through Caleb's gloved hand for a second as Milo bounded across the yard, scattering powder behind his oversized paws. The front door opened. Walter stepped onto the porch wearing the same dark flannel shirt beneath a brown canvas jacket. Though today his silver hair was covered by the faded veteran's cap Caleb had seen him wear around town. His expression began with irritation at the sight of the police vehicle, but it lasted only until he saw the dog. "Milo?" The puppy heard his name and ran faster. Walter had barely made it down the first porch step when Milo reached him. The young shepherd jumped against the old man's legs, tail whipping back and forth, whining with such frantic happiness that Walter had to grab the porch rail to keep his balance. "Easy, you fool," Walter said, but there was no anger in the words. Then something remarkable happened. Walter laughed. It was not the brief, polite sound Caleb had heard the day before when Walter joked about his heating bill. This laugh came from somewhere deeper, warm and surprised, as if Milo had found a door inside the old man that had not been opened in years. Walter lowered himself carefully, and Milo immediately climbed halfway into his lap, licking his chin and pushing his head beneath the old man's hands. Walter buried his fingers in the thick fur around Milo's neck and held him close. "You remember me, huh?" Milo answered by nearly knocking off his cap. Walter caught it at the last moment, muttering something about raising a dog with no respect for senior citizens, and Caleb found himself smiling again. For those few seconds, the guarded 78-year-old man from yesterday seemed to disappear. What remained was simply someone reunited with a creature he loved. Then the wind shifted. A snow shovel that had been leaning against the porch railing slid sideways. It struck the concrete step with a violent, metallic clang. Walter's entire body reacted before his mind could. His shoulders jerked sharply, his eyes widened, and one arm flew upward in a sudden defensive motion. Milo recoiled. The puppy dropped low against the snow and backed away several feet, ears flattened, his body tense and uncertain. Everything changed. Walter lowered his arm slowly. The happiness vanished from his face. He looked at Milo, then at his own hand. Caleb had expected embarrassment, perhaps irritation at being seen in a vulnerable moment, but what crossed Walter's face was far more painful. Shame. The old man stepped backward. Milo. The puppy remained crouched. Walter's hand trembled visibly at his side, and when Milo took another small step away, something in the old veteran seemed to collapse. "Take him back." Caleb did not move. "Walter, I said take him back. He's frightened because of the noise." Walter turned toward the porch. "He's frightened because of me." Caleb walked closer but kept his voice calm. "He ran straight to you 30 seconds ago. That doesn't matter. I think it matters to him." Walter looked over his shoulder, and the anger Caleb saw there lasted barely a moment before exhaustion replaced it. "You want to know why I left him?" Caleb waited. Walter sat heavily on the top porch step. Milo remained several yards away, watching him. For a long time, Walter said nothing. When he finally began speaking, his eyes stayed fixed on the snowy yard rather than Caleb. "There are things the body remembers longer than the mind wants to," he explained, that after coming home from military service decades earlier, he had learned to live around certain reactions rather than overcome them. Sudden explosions, fireworks, metal crashing against metal. Even a car backfiring in the wrong place could pull him somewhere else for a second or two. Most people around him never noticed because Walter had become skilled at hiding it. And when he was younger, he could recover quickly enough to pretend nothing had happened. Age had changed that. His hands had begun to shake more often in recent years, particularly when he was tired or startled, and his reflexes were no longer as controlled as they once had been.
"I don't hit him," Walter said quietly, glancing toward Milo.
Never have. Caleb nodded. I know. But he doesn't know what this is. Walter lifted his trembling hand. To him, I'm just an old man who sometimes moves too fast for no reason. Caleb sat on the opposite end of the porch step without asking. Walter stared at the yard for another moment before continuing. A few weeks earlier, he had been preparing dinner with Milo stretched across the kitchen floor nearby. Walter had turned too quickly and knocked a heavy cast-iron pan from the counter. It hit the floor with a deafening crash. The sound startled Milo awake. At nearly the same instant, Walter reacted violently to the noise, knocking over a chair as he turned. Milo panicked and bolted toward the back door, which Walter had left open while bringing in firewood. The puppy ran straight outside. Walter followed, calling his name. Milo crossed the yard and reached the road just as a delivery truck came around the bend. The driver slammed on the brakes. Walter could still remember the sound of the tires sliding across the cold pavement. The truck stopped only a few feet from Milo. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the driver leaned out the window and shouted something Walter barely heard, because by then he was standing beside the road, with both hands shaking so badly that he could not even fasten Milo's leash. He came back to me, Walter said. That was the worst part. Caleb looked at him. Walter swallowed hard. He came right back like I hadn't just scared him half to death. Afterward, Walter had taken Milo inside, checked every inch of him for injuries, and sat on the kitchen floor with the puppy pressed against his side. Milo had recovered within minutes. Walter had not. For nearly 10 minutes, he had stood by the window afterward, watching the road, unable to stop trembling as he imagined what would have happened if the truck had been traveling slightly faster. That night, after Milo fell asleep beside the stove, Walter made his decision. He would give him up before the next accident became the last one. Caleb listened without interrupting. Across the yard, Milo had slowly risen from his crouch. He took one cautious step toward the porch, then another. Walter noticed. Don't. Milo stopped. Walter looked away. I thought if I left him somewhere safe, maybe somebody younger would take him. Somebody whose hands work right. Somebody who doesn't turn a dropped pan into a disaster. You could have asked for help. Walter gave a tired, humorless smile. I've spent most of my life making sure I didn't need it. That doesn't mean you don't now. Walter's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Milo took another step closer. Walter watched him and whispered, He's 5 months old, Caleb. He shouldn't have to learn how to be afraid of the man feeding him. Caleb looked from Walter to the puppy, but before he could answer, Walter spoke again. This time, his voice was barely above a murmur. I can live with him missing me. Milo had reached the bottom step. Walter looked down at him, and the grief in his expression stripped away every trace of pride. I can't live with being the reason he dies. Caleb did not ask Walter to take Milo back that afternoon, because after hearing the old veteran describe the truck stopping only a few feet from the terrified puppy, he understood that another argument about love or responsibility would accomplish very little. Walter did not doubt that he loved Milo. If anything, that was precisely the problem. In his mind, loving the dog meant protecting him from the one danger Walter believed he could not control. And no reassurance from a police officer was going to erase a fear that had been growing inside him for weeks. Instead, Caleb began visiting. At first he told Walter he was simply checking that everything was all right, which was close enough to the truth that neither man needed to challenge it. A few days later, Caleb arrived with 2 coffees from a small diner on the edge of town and claimed they had accidentally given him an extra one. Walter looked at the 2 cups, then at Caleb, and remarked that restaurants in Roanoke appeared to make unusually convenient mistakes whenever police officers were worried about elderly veterans. He took the coffee anyway. Those visits gradually became less formal. Caleb learned that Walter liked his coffee strong enough to make most sensible people reconsider their life choices, that he listened to old country radio while repairing things in the garage, and that he owned enough hand tools to rebuild half of Roanoke, but insisted on keeping 3 broken flashlights because, according to him, they might become useful after civilization collapses. Walter remained guarded whenever conversation moved toward his military service or his health. Yet outside those subjects, he possessed a dry humor Caleb had never expected from the stern old man he had known only in passing. Milo remained at the station during the first few visits, where several officers had already become embarrassingly fond of him. But Caleb eventually decided Walter and the puppy needed something between separation and permanent reunion. One mild afternoon, with the temperature finally climbing above freezing, Caleb brought Milo along and kept him on a long leash in the yard, rather than allowing him immediately into the house. Walter came onto the porch, crossed his arms, and tried very hard to appear unimpressed. "I thought we discussed this. We discussed you not keeping him yet," Caleb replied. "Nobody said he couldn't visit." Milo stood in the snow, staring at Walter with intense concentration, his tail moving from side to side like a slow metronome. Walter avoided looking at him for almost 30 seconds, which might have been more convincing if the pocket of his canvas jacket had not contained several dog biscuits. Milo noticed them before Caleb did. The puppy moved closer, sat directly in front of Walter, and lifted his nose toward the old man's pocket. Walter frowned. "No." Milo tilted his head. Walter shifted his weight. The puppy tilted his head farther. Caleb had to look away to hide a smile. "He doesn't know anything is in there," Walter said. Milo raised one paw and placed it gently against Walter's knee. "That's coincidence." The German Shepherd stared up at him. Walter lasted another 5 seconds before pulling out a biscuit. "You can fool a police officer," Caleb said, "but apparently not a German Shepherd." Walter muttered something unrepeatable about both professions, yet he was smiling as Milo accepted the treat with exaggerated politeness. Those small afternoons began doing what Caleb's arguments could not. Walter still refused to call Milo his dog, but he started asking when Caleb might bring him again. He corrected Caleb on how much food Milo should receive after long walks, complained that the puppy's coat was being brushed in the wrong direction, and once spent 15 minutes explaining why Milo preferred sleeping with his back against something solid. Each observation revealed the same truth Walter continued trying to deny. He had not stopped being Milo's person simply because he had tied a leash to a police station gate. Caleb soon began looking for another kind of help. Through a veterans outreach coordinator, he was referred to Dr. Elaine Mercer, a 58-year-old counselor who had spent more than 2 decades working with aging veterans experiencing long-standing trauma responses. Elaine was a slender woman with cropped silver blonde hair, warm hazel eyes, and a calm manner that never became overly gentle or pitying. Her father had served in Vietnam and had refused counseling until late in life, an experience that shaped her belief that older veterans often rejected help not because they were unwilling to heal, but because independence had become part of how they survived. When Caleb explained Walter's situation over the phone, Elaine listened without interrupting and then said something he remembered. "Men like Mr. Briggs often hear the word help and think it means somebody plans to take their life away from them. You may have better luck showing him how help could give something back." Walter's response was exactly what Caleb expected. No. They were standing in his kitchen when Caleb mentioned the Veterans Support Program, and Walter rejected the idea before Caleb had finished describing it. "She's not trying to put you anywhere." "No. She works with veterans your age. That's unfortunate for them." "Walter." The old man placed his coffee mug in the sink and turned toward him. "I'm 78 years old. Whatever is wrong with me has had more than 50 years to get comfortable. I'm not going to sit in a room explaining my childhood to somebody with a clipboard. It isn't about your childhood. You know what I mean." Caleb could have argued, but Elaine's advice came back to him. Instead, he glanced toward the window, where Milo was lying outside near the porch with his muzzle resting over his paws. "What if it isn't for you?" Walter followed his gaze. Caleb continued quietly. What if it's for Milo? Walter did not answer. If there's a way to make those moments safer for him, wouldn't you want to know? The old veteran's jaw tightened, though Caleb could see the argument had reached somewhere pride could not easily defend. Several seconds passed before Walter sighed. One appointment. Caleb nodded. One. And if she starts asking me to describe my feelings as colors, I'm leaving. Caleb smiled. I'll warn her. That same week, Caleb also contacted Megan Holloway, a 44-year-old service dog trainer who worked outside Salem, just west of Roanoke. Megan was a compact, athletic woman with curly auburn hair, usually tied behind her head, and the steady confidence of someone accustomed to communicating with animals before their owners were ready to listen. She had begun training service dogs after her younger brother returned from military duty with severe anxiety, and discovered that his dog could recognize the early signs of distress long before anyone else in the family did. When Caleb described Milo's age and Walter's reactions, Megan was cautious but interested. At 5 months, Milo is still very young, she explained. That's actually helpful in some ways. We wouldn't be trying to turn him into something he isn't. We'd teach him routines that make both of them safer. The idea was not simply to train Milo to obey commands. Megan believed the young shepherd could eventually learn to recognize changes in Walter's breathing and movement, interrupt escalating stress, remain close instead of fleeing from sudden noise, and seek another person if Walter became overwhelmed. For the first time since finding Milo at the gate, Caleb could imagine a solution that did not require choosing between Walter's safety and the dog's. Yet just as the path ahead seemed to become clearer, Caleb began noticing something else. One afternoon, he arrived at Walter's house and found the old man checking the back door for the 3rd time in less than 5 minutes. You waiting for somebody? Caleb asked. Walter frowned at the lock. No, thought I forgot to secure it. You already checked it. Walter looked at him with mild annoyance. Well, now it's especially secure. Caleb let the moment pass. A few days later, he pulled into the driveway and found Walter standing near the edge of the yard without a coat, wearing only a flannel shirt despite the bitter air. The old man was staring toward the pine trees with an expression Caleb had never seen before. Not frightened exactly, but distant. Caleb got out of the car. Walter? The old veteran turned slowly. What are you doing out here? Walter looked around as though the question required more thought than it should have. I came out for something. What? Walter opened his mouth, then closed it. After several seconds, he gave an embarrassed laugh. Apparently something important enough to forget. He turned toward the house as though the matter were settled. Caleb watched him walk back inside. Walter could joke about a forgotten reason for stepping into the yard, just as he could joke about checking the same lock twice or losing track of where he had set his glasses. But Caleb had spent too many years noticing small changes in people to dismiss what he was seeing. Something was shifting beneath Walter's familiar stubbornness, and for once the old man's refusal to ask for help might not be the only danger Caleb needed to worry about. The first training sessions were deliberately simple, because Megan Holloway understood that neither Milo nor Walter would benefit from being rushed. Milo was still only 5 months old, full of the restless intelligence and clumsy enthusiasm of a German shepherd puppy who could learn a new command in 10 minutes and forget it just as quickly if something more interesting appeared nearby. Walter, meanwhile, had spent decades depending almost entirely on himself, which made the idea of relying on a dog feel nearly as uncomfortable as relying on another person. Megan therefore began with routines that looked almost ordinary. Sitting quietly together, rewarding Milo for staying close when Walter's breathing changed, and teaching the puppy that sudden movement did not always mean danger. At first, Walter approached the process with the skepticism of a man convinced that everyone around him was making things more complicated than necessary. He followed Megan's instructions, but whenever she praised Milo for touching his nose to Walter's hand or settling against his leg, Walter would mutter that the puppy had probably done it because he smelled biscuits. Megan rarely argued. She had learned years earlier that stubborn men and young dogs often responded to the same strategy: patience, consistency, and the occasional well-timed piece of chicken. Caleb attended whenever his shifts allowed, partly because Milo already trusted him, and partly because Walter was more willing to participate when the sessions felt less clinical. During one afternoon visit, Megan taught Milo to place his head across Walter's knee whenever the old man began showing signs of tension. At first, Milo interpreted the exercise as permission to climb almost entirely into Walter's lap, which resulted in 70 pounds of future German Shepherd trying to fit into a space designed for perhaps half of him. Walter pushed gently against the puppy's chest. "Your head, not your entire ancestry." Caleb laughed from across the room. Megan calmly reset the exercise. By the fourth attempt, Milo lowered only his head onto Walter's knee and remained there, looking up at him with such obvious satisfaction that even Walter could not pretend he was unimpressed. The next step was more difficult. Milo needed to learn that an unexpected noise did not require him to run away. Megan began with soft sounds at a distance, tapping a wooden spoon against a table while Walter rewarded Milo for staying beside him. Over several sessions, the sounds became slightly sharper, though never enough to overwhelm either of them. Walter's shoulders still tightened at certain noises, and Milo occasionally stood as though preparing to flee, but Megan taught Walter to lower one hand toward the puppy rather than wave him away. "Give him somewhere to go," she explained. "If he learns that your hand means safety, then eventually he may come toward you instead of away from you." Walter looked down at his trembling fingers. "That assumes the hand is safe." Megan met his eyes without pity. "Then we teach both of you that it can be." That answer stayed with him. The training slowly expanded. Caleb would sometimes step into another room while Megan encouraged Walter to send Milo to find him. At first, the puppy treated the assignment like a game, charging through the house with his nails skittering across the wooden floor, checking every doorway twice, and occasionally forgetting why he had left Walter in the first place. Once he discovered Caleb in the hallway, received praise, and then proudly returned carrying one of Walter's socks instead of completing the exercise. Walter stared at the sock. Milo wagged his tail. "You had one job." The puppy sat down. Caleb glanced at Megan. "Technically, he found something." Walter tried to remain stern but failed, and soon he was laughing hard enough that he had to sit down. Those moments began to matter almost as much as the training itself. Caleb noticed that Walter no longer spoke about Milo as though the dog belonged to some future stranger. He started saying things like, "He needs another 5 minutes outside," or "Don't let him drink too fast after he runs," without seeming to notice what those words revealed. The house changed as well. Milo's bed was no longer merely waiting beside the stove, it was being used again. The water bowl was filled each morning. A chewed rubber ball began appearing in different rooms, and Walter stopped pretending that these were temporary arrangements. Megan also began working on nighttime routines. Walter admitted, reluctantly, that he sometimes woke from vivid dreams disoriented and breathing hard, though he refused to describe them in detail. Milo was taught to respond when Walter moved restlessly or made certain sounds, first by waking and touching him with a paw, then by pressing close enough for Walter to feel the weight and warmth of his body. The first few attempts were not elegant. One night during practice, Milo interpreted "wake him gently" as place both front paws directly on Walter's stomach. And Walter came upright with a startled grunt, while Caleb, observing from the doorway, had to turn away to hide his laughter. "If the nightmares don't kill me," Walter complained, "this dog will." But he scratched Milo behind the ears while saying it. As the days passed, something subtle began changing in Walter. He still startled. His hands still trembled. He still disliked discussing anything that sounded too much like therapy. But he no longer seemed convinced that every one of his reactions made him dangerous. Milo was learning to remain nearby, and Walter was learning that a frightened moment did not automatically become a catastrophe. Then came the afternoon that changed something deeper. Megan had been working with them in the kitchen, using ordinary household noises because Walter needed the training to feel connected to real life. Caleb stood near the counter, while Milo rested several feet from Walter, attentive but relaxed. Megan reached for a light metal tray. Her sleeve caught its edge, the tray slipped. It hit the floor with a sharp, explosive crash. Walter reacted instantly. His shoulders snapped upward, one arm rose, and his body twisted as though preparing for danger that no longer existed. Milo jumped to his feet. For a fraction of a second, Caleb saw the same fear that had sent the puppy running during the cast-iron pan incident. Milo stepped backward. Walter saw it. His face changed. Then the puppy stopped. He did not run. The room became very still. Milo looked at Walter, ears lowered but eyes fixed on him, as though something learned over the past weeks was competing with instinct. Walter slowly lowered his trembling hand. Milo took one step forward, then another. No one spoke. The puppy approached until he stood directly in front of Walter, then gently pushed his head beneath the old man's hand. Walter froze. His fingers rested against the black fur between Milo's ears. The trembling did not stop immediately, but Milo remained where he was. Walter's mouth tightened, his eyes filled. Caleb had seen him angry, embarrassed, amused, and frightened. But until that afternoon, he had never seen Walter Briggs cry. The old veteran turned his face slightly, as if ashamed of the tears, yet he did not remove his hand from Milo's head. "He stayed," Walter whispered. Milo pressed closer. Walter swallowed hard. "He still trusts me." Caleb said nothing, because there was nothing useful to add. For Walter, the moment was not about a successful training exercise. It was the first proof that the accident weeks earlier had not destroyed what existed between him and Milo. The puppy remembered the fear, perhaps, but he had also learned something stronger. When frightened, he could still choose to come back. That evening, Caleb left Walter's house feeling more hopeful than he had since finding Milo tied outside the station. Several hours later, his phone rang. The caller was Margaret Ellis, Walter's 68-year-old neighbor who lived 2 houses down. Margaret was a small, practical woman with short gray hair and the alert manner of someone who had spent 30 years as an elementary school secretary and had developed the habit of noticing anything out of place. She and Walter were not particularly close, but she checked on him during bad weather and occasionally left soup on his porch without asking whether he wanted it. Her voice sounded unsettled. "Officer Monroe, I'm sorry to bother you, but I think something's wrong with Walter." Caleb sat straighter. "What happened?" "I looked outside maybe 20 minutes ago and saw him standing in the road." Caleb frowned. "In the road?" "In his pajamas, Caleb. No coat. No shoes except slippers. He was just standing there like he didn't know where he was." The warmth Caleb had carried from the afternoon disappeared. "Did you speak to him?" "Yes." He looked at me for a few seconds before he recognized me. Then he laughed and said he must have gone outside to check something. Margaret hesitated. "But he couldn't tell me what." Caleb stared into the darkness beyond his window, remembering Walter checking the same lock again and again, then standing in his yard unable to remember why he had gone outside. The metal crashes, the trembling hands, and the old reflexes had always seemed like the greatest threat. Now Caleb was beginning to understand that they might not be. By the following evening, winter had tightened its grip on Roanoke with a force the city had been warned about all day. Snow began falling before sunset and quickly thickened into a blinding curtain, while powerful winds swept down from the Blue Ridge and pushed drifts across roads almost as quickly as plows could clear them. By 8 o'clock, tree limbs were bending under the weight of ice. Transformers had begun failing in several neighborhoods, and scattered sections of the city were sinking into darkness as power lines went down beneath the storm. Caleb had been thinking about Walter since Margaret Ellis's call the night before. Walter had dismissed that episode as nothing more than an absent-minded walk outside, but Caleb could not forget the image of a 78-year-old man standing in the middle of a winter road, wearing pajamas and slippers, unable to explain why he had left his house. The approaching storm made that concern harder to ignore, especially now that the weather had become dangerous enough that even a healthy person could become disoriented within minutes.
During a brief lull between calls, Caleb took out his phone and dialed Walter's number. It rang until voicemail answered. He waited several minutes and tried again, still nothing. Caleb told himself Walter might have fallen asleep early, or perhaps the storm had interrupted service near the edge of town. But when he called a third time and received no answer, the uneasiness he had been carrying since the previous night sharpened into something more immediate. He was already reaching for his winter coat when his phone rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "Caleb?" Her voice was nearly swallowed by wind. "What happened? I went over to check on him because our lights flickered out, and his back door is open." Caleb was moving before she finished the sentence. "Is Walter there?" I called inside. "I didn't see him. What about Milo? I heard him barking." Caleb grabbed his keys. "Go back to your house, Margaret. Lock your doors and stay inside. I'm on my way." The drive toward Walter's neighborhood took almost twice as long as usual. Visibility had fallen to only a few car lengths in places, and snow blew sideways across the windshield in violent bursts that made the road vanish beneath Caleb's headlights. Fallen branches forced him to slow more than once, and when he finally turned onto Walter's lane, several houses were completely dark except for the weak orange glow of battery lanterns behind windows. Walter's front porch light was out. The back door stood open. Caleb parked as close as he could and ran through the snow, his boots sinking above the ankles before he reached the porch. Milo's barking became audible the moment he stepped inside, deep and urgent now that the puppy was growing larger, and Caleb found him pacing frantically between the kitchen and the open rear doorway. Milo. The German shepherd rushed toward him, then immediately turned and ran back to the door. Caleb scanned the house. The first thing he noticed was Walter's heavy canvas coat hanging from its usual hook beside the entrance. His gloves were underneath it. On the kitchen table sat a glass of water beside a small plastic pill organizer, several evening doses still inside. Walter's boots were gone, but everything else suggested he had not prepared to leave the house for more than a few minutes. Caleb moved through each room calling Walter's name, though he already knew there would be no answer. The bedroom was empty. The bathroom was empty. The garage door remained locked from inside. When he returned to the kitchen, Milo was at the back door again. The puppy scraped his front paws against the threshold and whined. Caleb stepped outside and aimed his flashlight toward the yard. Fresh snow was already filling everything, yet just beyond the porch he could make out a disturbed line in the white surface. Footprints. Human. They led across the yard toward the pines behind the house. Caleb crouched and examined them as the wind drove snow against his face. The tracks were uneven, some steps shorter than others, as though Walter had been walking without a clear direction. They continued toward the tree line before becoming harder to distinguish beneath newly falling snow. Caleb looked back toward the house. Milo stays inside. The German shepherd stood in the doorway, watching him. Walter had insisted on that rule after the near accident with the truck. Until Milo's training was further along, the puppy was not to be outside near roads or woods without a leash, especially when Walter was alone. Caleb understood the logic, and in weather like this, losing the dog as well as Walter would turn one emergency into two. He stepped inside long enough to pull the door mostly closed. Milo immediately began scratching at it. "Stay!" The puppy scratched harder. Caleb reached for the radio on his shoulder and reported Walter missing, giving the address and requesting additional help as conditions allowed. He knew response times would be difficult. Officers across Roanoke were already dealing with stalled vehicles, fallen trees, and power outages, and Walter's property bordered enough wooded land that a search could quickly become complicated. Behind him, Milo barked. Caleb turned. The puppy was no longer running wildly around the kitchen. He stood squarely at the door, staring directly at Caleb, then looked toward the woods. He barked again. Caleb watched him. Milo, no. The German shepherd moved his nose toward the crack beneath the door and inhaled repeatedly. Then he looked back at Caleb and gave another sharp bark. It did not sound panicked. It sounded deliberate. Megan's training came back to Caleb. Teach Milo to find a familiar person. Teach him to follow scent. Teach him that when Walter was in trouble,
Staying close and seeking help mattered more than fleeing. Milo pawed the door once more. Caleb hesitated. Then he reached for the red leash hanging beside the entrance. "All right, but you stay with me." The moment the clip attached to Milo's collar, the puppy surged forward with such force that Caleb had to brace one hand against the doorframe. Outside, Milo lowered his nose toward Walter's fading tracks and immediately pulled toward the trees. Caleb followed. The woods swallowed them within minutes. Wind tore through the pines overhead, shaking loose heavy clumps of snow that dropped from branches without warning. Caleb's flashlight illuminated only a narrow tunnel through the storm, and the footprints disappeared completely after the first 100 yards. From there, Milo became their only clear direction. The puppy moved differently than he had during ordinary training. There was no playful wandering, no fascination with fallen sticks, no sudden detours toward interesting smells. He kept his nose low, occasionally stopping to circle one patch of ground before choosing a direction and pulling forward again. Milo. Slow. The dog barely reduced his pace. Caleb checked his phone, but the signal was weak. He had traveled only a few hundred yards from the house, yet the storm made the distance feel much greater. Behind them, their own tracks were already becoming soft-edged beneath fresh snow. They continued downhill through thicker trees. Once Milo stopped beside a narrow opening between two pines and sniffed the bark of one trunk before turning sharply left. Caleb followed, increasingly aware that Walter had walked much farther from home than anyone in his condition should have. A quarter mile became nearly half a mile. The temperature seemed to fall with every step. Caleb's breath condensed around his face, and ice had begun forming along the edge of his cap. Milo's fur was covered with snow, but the puppy continued pulling with stubborn determination. Then the leash caught. Caleb felt it jerk tight and turned to see the red line wrapped around the end of a fallen branch protruding from beneath the snow. "Hold on." He crouched and began working the leash free. Milo whined sharply. "I know." The knot had twisted beneath the branch. Caleb removed one glove and reached closer, loosening the line with cold fingers. It took only a few seconds. That was enough. A sudden gust shook the trees overhead. Milo lunged forward, and the wet leash slipped from Caleb's hand before he could close his fingers around it. "Milo!" The German shepherd disappeared between the pines. Caleb stood and ran after him. "Milo!" There was no answer except the wind. His flashlight swept through the trees, catching only falling snow and dark trunks. For one terrible moment, Caleb imagined returning to Walter's house without either of them. He moved farther downhill, calling again. "Milo!" Nothing. Then he stopped. Somewhere ahead, faint beneath the storm, came a bark. Caleb turned toward the sound. A second bark followed. Then a third. 3 short, sharp calls from somewhere beyond the trees. Caleb tightened his grip on the flashlight and started toward them. Milo had found something. Caleb moved toward the barking as quickly as the storm would allow, pushing through knee-deep snow while branches whipped against his coat, and the beam of his flashlight bounced wildly across the dark trunks ahead. The 3 barks had come from somewhere downhill, beyond a thick stand of pines where the ground dropped sharply toward one of the narrow creeks that wound through the wooded outskirts of Roanoke. He called Milo's name again, and this time a single bark answered almost immediately, closer now and more urgent than before. When Caleb broke through the trees, the beam of his flashlight found the red leash first, stretched across the snow like a thin line pointing toward the creek below. Milo stood near the bottom of a steep embankment, his black and tan coat almost white with wind-blown snow, his body positioned over a dark shape lying beside the frozen water. "Walter!" Caleb started down the slope. The ground beneath the snow was slick with ice, forcing him to descend sideways while grabbing at exposed branches for balance. Below him, the creek was almost completely frozen, though a narrow ribbon of black water still moved beneath broken plates of ice near the bank. Walter lay several feet above the waterline where the slope flattened briefly before reaching the creek, one leg twisted beneath him and one shoulder pressed against a fallen log.
His clothes were covered with snow, and because he had left the house without his heavy coat, the thin flannel shirt and sweater he wore offered almost no protection against the cold. Milo stood beside him. Every few seconds the puppy lowered his head and pushed his nose against Walter's cheek, then moved to the old man's hands before returning to his face. Walter's eyes would close for a moment, and Milo would nudge him again until they opened. The exercise Megan had taught Milo to interrupt Walter's distress had never been designed for anything like this. But the young German shepherd seemed to understand the only thing that mattered. Walter had to stay awake. Caleb reached them and dropped to one knee. "Walter, can you hear me?" Walter's eyelids moved. For several seconds, his gaze wandered past Caleb without recognition, and then some awareness returned. "Caleb, I'm here." Walter's teeth were chattering hard enough to make his next words difficult to understand. "I think I fell." Caleb glanced up at the slope. Walter's tracks descended erratically from the trees, and one section showed where the snow had been disturbed over several yards. He had apparently lost his footing near the edge and slid down until the fallen log stopped him. Trying to climb back up in darkness and deep snow would have been difficult for anyone, let alone a 78-year-old man already exhausted and confused. Caleb pulled off his outer winter jacket and wrapped it around Walter's shoulders before checking him as carefully as he could without moving him unnecessarily. "Don't try to stand yet. I wasn't planning to." Even weak and shivering, Walter managed a trace of his usual dry humor. Milo pushed his head under Walter's hand. The old man looked down. For a moment his expression went blank, as though he could not understand why the puppy was there. Then recognition came. Milo. The German shepherd's tail moved against the snow. Walter stared at him with an expression Caleb could barely read. Only days earlier, this same man had been convinced that keeping Milo close would eventually destroy the dog. And now the puppy Walter had once tied to a police station gate had crossed half a mile of storm-covered forest to find him. Walter slowly lifted one trembling hand. Milo moved closer at once. The old man touched his head. "I left you," Walter whispered. His voice broke. "I left you there." Milo did not understand the confession. Or perhaps he understood the only part that mattered. He leaned forward and licked Walter's cold fingers, then pressed his muzzle into the old man's palm. Walter closed his eyes. Caleb saw tears gather at their corners before the wind carried them away. There was no judgment in the dog's response, no hesitation, and no demand that Walter explain why he had walked away. Milo simply remained beside him, warm and stubborn and completely uninterested in the old man's belief that he was somehow unworthy of being loved. Walter looked at Caleb. "I thought I was protecting him." "I know. I thought if I got him away from me, he'd be safe." Caleb glanced at Milo, who had now settled against Walter's side as closely as possible. "Looks like he had a different idea." A weak laugh escaped Walter, but it quickly turned into a shiver. Caleb reached for his radio and called in their location, giving the best coordinates his phone could provide and describing the creek and the slope. A search and rescue unit was already moving toward the area from the road, but the storm and fallen branches made the approach slow. While they waited, Caleb kept Walter talking. He asked simple questions about the house, about Milo, even about the old truck in the driveway. Walter answered some clearly and struggled with others. At one point he asked why they were near the creek, then seemed embarrassed when Caleb reminded him that he had wandered from home. "I don't remember coming this far." "That's something we'll deal with later." Walter looked away. Normally that sentence would have been enough to start an argument about doctors, independence, or people interfering in his life. This time, he said nothing. Several minutes later, voices sounded from above. The rescue team had arrived. Leading them was Daniel Price, a 46-year-old Roanoke rescue lieutenant with a heavy build, a close-cropped dark beard already collecting ice, and the calm, deliberate manner of a man who had spent 2 decades moving injured people out of places where panic could make everything worse. He assessed the slope, organized a rope line,
and descended with two other rescuers carrying an insulated rescue blanket and a compact stretcher. Walter tried to object when they began preparing him for the climb. "I can walk." Daniel looked at the steep slope, then at Walter. "Sir, you can either ride up comfortably or make 4 grown men chase you down this creek after you fall again." Walter stared at him. Daniel added, "I'd personally appreciate the first option." Caleb heard Walter mutter that everybody in Roanoke had suddenly become a comedian, but he stopped arguing. The rescuers wrapped him carefully in thermal blankets and secured him to the stretcher. Milo became immediately restless when they lifted Walter from the ground, circling the team and trying to remain close enough to touch him. "Milo," Caleb called. The puppy looked back but refused to retreat more than a few feet. During the slow climb up the slope, Milo followed directly behind the stretcher, stopping whenever the rescuers stopped and moving again the instant Walter moved. Even when Caleb tried to guide him around a safer path, the German shepherd kept returning to Walter's side. By the time they reached the vehicles, the old man was exhausted but still conscious. Milo tried to climb into the ambulance after him. Caleb caught the leash just before the puppy succeeded. "He'll be there," Caleb told Walter. Walter looked toward Milo. This time there was no mention of shelters, new owners, or finding somebody better. "Don't let him think I left again." "I won't." Several hours later, after Walter had been warmed, examined, and stabilized at the hospital, Caleb sat beside his bed while Milo waited temporarily with an officer outside the treatment area. Walter looked smaller beneath the white blankets, his silver hair still damp from melted snow and his face pale from exhaustion. A physician named Dr. Rebecca Sloan, a 51-year-old woman with dark hair streaked with gray and a direct but reassuring manner, explained that Walter had been fortunate. He needed continued observation after the prolonged cold exposure, and the episodes of confusion Caleb and Margaret had described also needed further medical evaluation, rather than being dismissed as ordinary aging. Walter listened without interrupting. Caleb expected the familiar response. "I'm fine. I can handle it. I don't need anybody." Instead, Walter stared at his hands for a long while. When Dr. Sloan finished speaking, he asked only one question. It was not about when he could leave. It was not about whether he could go home alone. Walter turned toward Caleb. "What do I have to do so Milo can come home with me?" Caleb looked at the old veteran and understood that something had changed beside that frozen creek. For the first time, Walter Briggs was not asking how to keep everyone away from his problems. He was asking how to let them help him stay with the one creature he could no longer pretend he wanted to lose. By the time winter finally loosened its hold on Roanoke, Virginia, the snowbanks along the quieter roads had collapsed into dark patches of melting ice, and the first green shoots were beginning to appear beneath the pines behind Walter Briggs's house. The old home itself looked almost exactly as it had several months earlier, with its faded gray siding, narrow porch, iron stove, and weathered pickup beside the garage. Yet the life inside it had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible on the morning Walter tied Milo to the gate of the police station. Walter still lived there, because accepting help had not required him to surrender the independence he had spent a lifetime protecting. Instead, his days were now supported by small safeguards that allowed him to remain where he belonged. A door alarm had been installed at the back entrance, so that if Walter opened it during a period of confusion, a soft chime sounded inside the house and an alert could be sent to a designated contact. Motion lights had been added around the porch, medications were organized more carefully, and Caleb kept a spare key in case Walter failed to answer his phone during another emergency. A community support worker named Linda Parker visited twice a week. Linda was a 55-year-old woman with short chestnut hair, a sturdy build, and the easy patience of someone who had spent most of her career helping older veterans remain independent without making them feel supervised. She had learned early that Walter disliked being fussed over, so she never arrived asking whether he was managing. Instead, she usually walked in complaining about Roanoke traffic, checked what needed checking while talking about ordinary things, and occasionally allowed Walter to believe that tightening a loose cabinet hinge had been his idea. Walter also began attending a small support group for older veterans. He did not suddenly become a man who enjoyed discussing his feelings, and Caleb suspected that expecting such a transformation would have been unreasonable. Walter still crossed his arms when conversations became too personal, still complained when meetings ran longer than scheduled, and once told Caleb that 8 old soldiers sitting in a circle drinking bad coffee should not qualify as therapy under any civilized definition. Yet he kept returning every week. That mattered. Milo's training continued as well. The German Shepherd was no longer the awkward 5-month-old puppy Caleb had carried through the police station doors. His body had begun filling out, his legs looked more proportional, and the rich black and tan coat across his shoulders had grown thicker and darker. He still possessed the curiosity of a young dog and remained fully capable of stealing a sock when the mood struck him. But his attention around Walter had become noticeably steadier. Under Megan Holloway's guidance, Milo learned to respond to patterns Walter himself did not always recognize. When the old man's breathing became shallow or his hands began shaking, Milo would move closer and press his muzzle against Walter's palm or rest his head across his knee. If Walter appeared confused while standing, Milo had learned to guide him toward the familiar chair beside the stove, where remaining seated gave him time to regain his bearings. Most importantly, if Walter became unresponsive or could not follow the routines they had practiced, Milo was being taught to seek out another person rather than remain alone beside him. The arrangement was not perfect. Some mornings Walter forgot what exercise they were practicing and blamed Milo for being confused, until Megan gently pointed out that the dog had actually been doing exactly what he was told. Other days Milo performed every task beautifully, and then celebrated by carrying Walter's house slipper into the yard. Walter called this sabotage. Megan called it adolescence. Caleb called it the first time in months that he had heard Walter laughing nearly every day. The deeper change was harder to measure. Walter no longer looked at his trembling hands as proof that Milo should be taken away from him. The reactions had not disappeared, nor had the moments of uncertainty that now required greater attention. But Walter had begun to understand that danger did not come simply from needing help. The real danger had come from hiding his struggles until there was nobody close enough to help when something went wrong. One mild afternoon in early spring, Caleb turned into the familiar driveway and found Walter sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee balanced beside his chair. The sun was warm enough that the old veteran had left his canvas jacket inside, and he wore only a blue flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. Milo lay stretched across the porch boards at his feet, larger now but still keeping one paw against Walter's boot as though maintaining physical contact was part of some private agreement between them. Walter looked toward Caleb's patrol car. "You're late." "I didn't know I had an appointment." "You always arrive around 3. Caleb checked his watch. "It's 3:07. Walter shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "Standards are collapsing." Caleb climbed the porch steps and accepted the second mug Walter had already prepared. It was, as usual, strong enough to remove paint. Then Caleb noticed something on the small table between them. A simple wooden frame sat beside Walter's coffee. Inside it was a piece of paper. Caleb recognized the handwriting before he even read the words. "Please find him someone better than me." For several seconds he simply stared at it. The note had been folded when Caleb found it beneath the dog food bag outside the station, and the old creases were still visible beneath the glass. He remembered the cold morning, Milo sitting against the iron fence, and Walter appearing on the security footage to look back 3 times before driving away. "I wondered where that went," Caleb said. Walter took a slow drink of coffee. "I asked for it." "Why would you want to keep that?" Walter looked down at Milo. The German Shepherd noticed the movement and lifted his head. For a moment, Walter said nothing. The old habit of avoiding emotional answers had not entirely disappeared, but these days he no longer seemed quite so frightened of the silence that followed them. "To remember," he finally said. "Remember what?" Walter rubbed one thumb against the handle of his mug. "That there was a time when I thought loving somebody meant knowing when to leave them." Caleb looked at the framed note again. Walter's expression softened. I figured if I disappeared from his life, somebody better would come along. Somebody steadier, somebody younger, somebody who didn't have to worry about what his own head or hands might do next. Milo stood and moved closer to Walter's chair. The old man scratched gently behind his ear. I spent a lot of years believing the strongest thing a man could do was make sure nobody had to carry him. Caleb remained quiet. Walter smiled faintly. Turns out sometimes you just have to learn how to stay. Milo leaned against his leg. Nothing about Walter's life had magically become easy. There would be more appointments, more precautions, more difficult mornings, and perhaps more moments when Walter would need help he wished he did not need. Milo would continue training, and the people around Walter would continue watching closely enough to notice when something changed. But the choice was no longer between independence and love. Walter had finally allowed both to exist in the same house. When Caleb eventually finished his coffee and headed toward the patrol car, Milo followed him down the porch steps, expecting the usual scratch beneath his chin before Caleb left. Caleb obliged, then opened the driver's door. Milo started back toward the house. Halfway across the yard, he turned and looked at Walter. Then he took several steps and looked back again. At the porch, he paused a third time. 3 times. Caleb noticed it immediately. Months earlier, Walter had crossed a snowy street toward his truck and looked back at Milo 3 times because every step was taking him farther away from the dog he loved. Now Milo crossed a spring yard and looked back 3 times for an entirely different reason. Walter was still there. The old man remained on the porch, one hand resting on the railing, waiting for him. Milo bounded up the steps and settled beside Walter's chair as though there had never been any question about where he belonged. And this time, neither of them had to wonder whether the other would come back. Walter and Milo remind us that love does not always mean having all the answers or being strong enough to face everything alone. Sometimes love means allowing someone to stay beside us when life becomes difficult. And sometimes courage begins with something as simple as admitting that we need help. In everyday life, many people carry worries, old wounds, or quiet fears that others may never see. We may even convince ourselves that the people we love would be better without our problems. But this story reminds us that the people and animals who truly care about us are not always asking us to be perfect. Sometimes they simply want us to stay, to keep trying, and to let them walk beside us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need this reminder today. And tell us in the comments what Walter and Milo taught you about love, loyalty, and second chances. If you believe that God sometimes sends comfort into our lives through the people and animals who refuse to leave our side, please comment Amen below. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can join us for more heartfelt stories about kindness, courage, loyalty, and the special bond between people and animals. Thank you for spending this time with us. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your heart, and watch over every loyal animal that brings love into our lives. Until the next story, take care of yourself and never forget that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply stay.